Welcome back to another episode of the Converge podcast. My name's Steve.
My name is Nate.
And we are here to help you have a Christian worldview in a post-Christian culture.
Dun, dun, dun.
Man.
All the news that's fit to print.
What's that from?
Don't know.
Again, welcome to the Converge podcast. Today is going to be the wrap-up episode for a three-part mini-series on talking about negative world and how culture has shifted, where its view of Christianity is concerned, whereas for many decades even, people viewed Christianity as being a positive force in society. The moral ethic of Christians was even treated as being kind of the backbone of American culture. But then between the late 80s into the 90s, we shifted into a neutral category where Christianity wasn't necessarily seen as a positive force in the culture, but it was seen as kind of a neutral territory where a shifting moral relativism changed people's view of Christians and especially the church. And so Christians sought to find common ground with people. But then somewhere, probably between 2010, 2014, somewhere around there, society shifted very quickly into viewing Christianity as a negative force in the world, to where even today, really the relationship between Christian culture and the culture at large is really devolving by the week sometimes, it feels like, with new issues and new movements in society. And so in all of our discussion, this of course isn't going to be an exhaustive discussion. There's so much more that there is to talk about, and that's work to be done in missiology and beyond. But today we specifically want to talk about the influence of critical theory outside of the church and inside of the church, and especially where people in the missional movement, people in the evangelical church, influential organizations like the Gospel Coalition, really a fracture that we saw last year that ended Together for the Gospel, 9 Marks, the Southern Baptist Convention, Acts 29 took a huge hit because of fractures because of critical race theory specifically. But we want to talk about whether or not, because the argument within kind of really even just evangelicalism, but we actually saw this big time in the governor's race in Virginia as to whether or not critical race theory, and I want to go beyond critical race theory to incorporate other forms of what it's rooted in, and that is Marxist critical theory, which critical theory is birthed out of the Marxist movement. Whether or not it's a boogeyman or whether or not it's an actual threat to society and to people.
Yeah, I think that's a very helpful thing to talk about, because kind of what we're seeing right now is a lot of the fractures in evangelicalism is happening because we've got leaders, and we're going to discuss some of these examples, who just don't know what time it is. They are just still stuck in a neutral world mindset. They do not understand the reality of how culture is pressing against the church in negative world. And specifically, I think what we're identifying is they don't understand the threat of critical theory to the point where they're actually mocking it as a threat. I mean, they're actually producing content that is telling Christians you don't need to worry about critical theory, you don't need to worry about queer theory, you don't need to worry about just all these different things that actually are pressing against the church. So to kind of wrap up our conversation, I think what we're trying to say, and we're going to go over this over our time here, is critical theory is not a boogeyman. It is a threat, and here's the reasons why. That's what we want to do.
Yeah, and really the fracturing that we've seen, especially inside of evangelicalism, and this is based on our viewpoint, is that leaders don't know what time it is. We say that a lot, that where it comes to culture, a lot of reaction, a lot of your views of even evangelism as a whole and what it means to be faithful to the gospel does require you to read the culture around you, to read the room in a sense, and know what time it is. In other words, that we believe that leaders, and this is specifically true of denominational leaders, church planting network leaders, they are simply misreading what time it is and what it means to have the right type of gospel influence in the culture around us. And a big issue is that there are a lot of men who are very soft, even cowardly. I would go so far as to say that, which cowardice is a sin, according to Scripture. And they're soft and they're cowardly and they are afraid of a culture war because they are convinced of this neutral world mindset that the way in which people are going to be brought to faith in Christ is by the culture viewing us as being very nice, very civil, very polite, men. And the fact that will aid us in being accepted by them before we ever even gain an audience for gospel influence. And that is just so foolish. And it's really based on an emerging pastoral ethic of listening to what I would call the wrong type of quote unquote experts and trusting men who were very good at a different time and had a lot of influence and wisdom to give at another time. But at this time, their softness, their insulation, the bubble that they live in is being exposed more and more to the point where we realize that things are being said by some of these, and let's just call them like Instagram influencers, but I have more respect for them than that. But they're kind of seen as the experts of evangelicalism. They say these things aren't going on, different things where having to be an ally in a company, having to have intersectional points to get promotions in a company, Christianity being treated as though it's a hateful force inside of Fortune 500 companies. They're saying, there's no evidence that that's actually happening. Whereas we've got our boots on the ground. We know people that work in these companies. They're members at our church. And we know that these things are literally taking place.
Yeah. You see a lot of these leaders and they just seem to have this aversion to talking about culture war. Like that's a dirty word that we cannot use a culture war. But when you look around in the news and you see a culture that is literally warring against faith, literally has the intention of tearing down and destroying faith, what is that but a culture war? And so I think we have got to find a way to embrace the reality that we are in a culture war, but at the same time teach our people how to fight that war effectively and not like buffoons.
Yeah, and the key is just because you say there's no culture war, that doesn't mean there's no culture war. It's like going out on a cloudy day and saying it's clear. That doesn't make the clouds dissipate. You better start believing in a culture war because you're in one, whether or not you like it or not. But the key is, how should you act inside of a culture war? So let's talk through some recent developments that's going on in really the universal church, or what we call evangelicalism, and highlight what we're talking about. And the first thing is an article it's bad. It's by a guy named Jake Meter who writes for a prolific evangelical blog, especially where younger reformed guys are concerned, called Mere Orthodoxy. And the title of the article is off the bat, CRT, or critical race theory, isn't going to get you. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, this article exemplifies what we're talking about. This is kind of big evangelical thought leader style. Saying, and he's talking to pastors, all right? So this is why I'm not expecting that most of the people in our church have seen this article, but believe me that a whole lot of pastors are. And he's basically telling pastors, the concern for your people is not CRT. That's overblown. It's a media hype. You actually need to get into the kind of real world life of your people and disciple them in Scripture, which of course, we 100% agree with that. But the false premise is that what he stated couldn't be more untrue.
Well, plus it's also point out the fact that not only is everything he's saying untrue, but a lot of what he's saying is also untrue because he's not even a pastor. And that's one thing that has happened, is there's a great influence of academics in the church where the roles have shifted, where seminarians used to view themselves as being assistants to the Church of Jesus Christ. Owen Strachan and Kevin Van Hooser talk about this in their book on being a public theologian. But the attitude shifted where Jake Meter has never pastored. He doesn't pastor, but he wants to tell pastors what's actually going on in their churches. And my guess would be he doesn't actually know any real people. And what I mean by that is
Yeah.
people outside of the seminarian bubble.
Yeah. He's just lying to people. He's telling people that they don't need to be concerned about something that is a real threat. And the reason behind it is really the insidious thing. And I believe fully the reason behind articles like this are to keep people from embarrassing kind of the evangelical elite from fighting a culture war. That's embarrassing to them. They don't like it when liberal news media, doesn't appreciate the emphasis on CRT, which is a real thing. We saw it in the news here in Virginia. Every single news station would say CRT is not being taught in the public schools when there's mountains of evidence that it is. And so this is just an evangelical leader trying to get people not to fight a culture war.
And he's glib.
Yeah.
So many statements that he makes in the article show that he's either glib in his understanding of philosophy, and I in no way mean to discount him. He's of course he buys into credentialism, so he's got the pedigree degrees for this. But what he shows is that he doesn't understand certain aspects of philosophy. He continuously points out different threats from the past and shows that all churches and pastors have always had, what he calls a threat of the weak. But what he reveals in this article is that he has no real base understanding of postmodernism. He doesn't understand the different forms of critical theory, but he also doesn't understand the intersection of postmodernism with the tenets of critical theory and how critical theory actually was a huge influence in the lives of guys like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and all of these different postmodern philosophers. And so what Meador does, or he does in this article, is he actually says, well, nobody can really define critical race theory, and since you can't define things like postmodernism to an accepted degree, and that's a lie. That's not true. That's what people say when they really haven't spent any time researching these things. They haven't spent any time reading the primary sources. They don't understand what was going on in the Frankfurt School. They don't understand critical theory is not a curriculum to be taught. It's a revolution to train people in social justice around. And so all that Meador really exposes in this article is the foolishness of evangelical influencers. And so the attitude of so many people is his attitude: don't overreact, because he's afraid of losing his influence with his Democratic friends. Yeah. It's not that they have influence with Democratic leaders. They don't. Those leaders don't care about any evangelical. He's afraid of 5 or 6 different Democrats that are completely liberal that he knows on Twitter or he knows at his local coffee shop. And he's terrified, the way that a lot of evangelical leaders are terrified right now, that a Democrat is going to see them as a hateful person. And that is a dumb thing to worry about. TGC, the Gospel Coalition, which is becoming less and less gospel-y by the week, also put out a video the very next week after Meador wrote this article. They're all connected to a degree, with the very same sentiment that mocks the idea of Christians being concerned over critical race theory, and before that, secular humanism, and before that, evolution, and before that, postmodernism.
Yeah. So you see more of this. People wonder, why are you guys always ripping on the Gospel Coalition and concerned about it? This is why. I mean, this is one of the most shameful videos I've ever seen put out by a quote unquote Christian organization. It really was terrible.
Yeah, let's be clear. It was a video podcast hosted by Jackie Hill Perry, who has a lot of influence where women's ministry is concerned. Also had the wife of a New Testament scholar, the wife of Michael Kruger, who's a great New Testament scholar, and they lie in this podcast with this same thing. Oh, nobody can even define critical race theory, and they say, oh, we don't know what these things are. And I know that's not true of Mrs. Kruger, because her husband has taught on these things, but it's also disingenuous of Jackie Hill Perry, who has in many instances outside of this podcast, and the receipts are there, she has advocated for specific tenets of critical race theory to be applied by society. And that's an important thing to understand about the adherents of critical race theory, because critical theory teaches you an epistemology of relativism. And it's not the type of relativism that is pluralistic in its approach. So it's not a relativism of tolerance. It is a relativism of strategy. And it's a strategy that allows you to lie. Since truth is relative, they can lie about something in order to further a godless agenda of anti-authoritarianism. And so people like Jackie Hill Perry, and I don't want to make any accusations towards her, but it is disingenuous at minimum to say no one can define critical race theory, but then in somewhere else argue for the tenets of critical race theory. And that shows me that you at least understand what the theory is. And more than that, you lie saying you can't define it.
Yeah. I mean, at a certain point, you just wonder what their motivations are on putting out stuff like this. You think people at this station in life must know better. And so it does appear the main motivation is disarming Christians. And again, just like we were talking about before, causing them to kind of put down their arms, not be on guard and defensive about culture war because it's embarrassing to them. But the kind of things that they kind of mock the idea of concern about secular humanism. You mentioned it's concern about evolution. These are all things that we have seen in the last 20, 30, 40 years absolutely wreck faith at different points. And so the idea of mocking concern for those things
and there's also
irresponsible.
It's irresponsible, and there's an aspect of it where they talk about the negative, but they don't explain what it is a negation of. Secular humanism is a negation of theism, and it is a negation of the Christian worldview. Evolution is a negation of creationism. And those are fundamental ideas of Christian discipleship. And so when we say they're threats, it's not a threat to me. And that's where Jake Meador he's missing the target, because it's not a threat to me. I am pretty far down the road.
Right.
I'm never going to buy into these theories. I'm never going to compromise. I'm never going to bend. It is a threat to people who are either new in the faith or children of people who are seeking to raise their children to be faithful followers of Jesus Christ. It is a threat, and people do need to be protected of it. And before you very quickly say, oh my goodness, are you guys becoming, discernment bloggers? And, we've been accused of that before. No, I just live sober to the idea that the Apostle Paul said, wolves will sneak into the church. And he says that the wolves are actually going to take the role of leaders in the church. And so I constantly, as a pastor, have to be careful that regardless of how many degrees a person has, regardless of what seminary they went to, regardless of what website they're on that used to be a faithful resource, I always have to keep in mind that sometimes the prophecy that the Apostle Paul gives comes to fruition. And it's going to happen in parachurch organizations quicker than it's going to have in the church, because quite frankly, parachurch organizations don't have the pastoral governance typically to protect them from those things. Yeah,
we're under a great upheaval right now in this transition to negative world, and it's why we're doing this podcast series. It's just kind of say, hey, no, we do not set out intending to be discernment bloggers, but we are trying to be discerning, and we are trying to say, hey, we notice some things being put out there in evangelicalism that you need to be very concerned about. And we are increasingly noticed just garbage material from Gospel Coalition. So we're going to have to say that. All right, another quick example, and this is just to kind of help everyone understand. These are the kind of things that we're seeing in evangelicalism. We've discussed in podcasts past a lot of leaders. This happened a lot at the last SBC convention, crying out that the real problem is renewed fundamentalism rather than critical theory in the culture. And that's just so silly.
Man, we've talked, and we did a whole episode on fundamentalism, but if your greatest fear is that more people are going to rise up in, where the Princeton theologians were concerned, and, acting like we should be afraid of guys that really fought liberalism in the old day. If that's your greatest fear, then you've got problems.
Absolutely.
Because that is not the problem. That's usually the solution. And we have to get the pendulum to go back the other way. And it's as foolish as James Merritt stood on stage at the last convention and made the statement, and of course I can't do his deep Southern accent, so I'm not going to try. It'll make Nate laugh. But, he made the statement, if you were as passionate about evangelism as you are about critical race theory, more people would be coming to faith in Christ. But that shows the great blind spot that a lot of evangelical leaders have, where they divorce divorce doctrinal faithfulness from evangelicalism. And what he's actually doing is he's putting his cards on the table, and he's showing that he believes it's necessary to allow unorthodox, false ideologies to enter into the life of the church. In order to do good evangelism, you have to discard faithful doctrine. And that's terrible.
Yeah.
I care about critical race theory because I care about evangelism. When you care about the faithfulness, the adherence of the local church to timeless principles of Scripture, to the doctrine handed down from the apostles to the early church, you are at the same time being very faithful to evangelism, because we are ensuring the health of the church that those won to Christ are going to come into. When we begin to falter at the level of doctrine, we ruin evangelism, because then we're going to be purporting false doctrine. Critical race theory has already done this because it seeks to hold people accountable for sin that they didn't even commit, for sins of the past, but also saying your involvement in what they would call sinful systems and structures is actually a sign of a new sin called whiteness that you need to repent of, a sin that Scripture never tells us about, a racist ideology that's called, it's not racist because the new definition of racist is you have to have power plus hatred, and saying that it's not racist just to point out that another race is sinful, and whiteness isn't even about being white. There's so much double talk that they try to make it so that nobody can define it, and that's where postmodernism and critical theory, especially where critical race theory is concerned, mix together to create a new orthodoxy that is more dangerous than anything else going on in the church right now. And so they want to focus on things that aren't threats to orthodoxy, while the real threats to orthodoxy is ruining evangelicalism, which evangelism is based in as a whole.
Now, that statement by James Merritt really does highlight everything that we're talking about. It shows a glibness to the real threat. The reason that he told people that they need to be more concerned about the gospel than critical race theory is he is embarrassed by the culture warring, and because in our culture, if you try to fight against the insidiousness of CRT, you're going to be accused of culture warring. And so he just, everything he just said, he doesn't see that if we do not push back against these false ideologies that seek to destroy faith, we're never going to be effective evangelists. And we're seeing that everywhere. We're seeing a overall broad problem of evangelical leaders that are not addressing the issues of the day. Leaders that are quick to speak up about popular things. So if something happens in the news, and we saw this a lot of BLM stuff in 2020, if something happens that would be kind of popular to address, they'll talk about that.
Oh, yeah.
But are they going to talk about groomers in the schools?
Right.
Are they going to talk about the absolute insidiousness of LGBT ideology seeping in everywhere? No, they're not going to address those things. And of course, something like CRT is completely off the table because that might offend someone. So evangelical leaders are just not addressing what's actually happening in people's lives.
The entire epistemology that these leaders are embracing is what J.D. Greear said so many times at the convention last year. The world is watching. And so what that does is it turns you into somebody that just embraces full-out pragmatism where Christian ministry is concerned. And you mentioned the issue now with grooming, and it keeps these men from being faithful to what the gospel actually does. The gospel takes sinners condemned under the wrath of God, turns them into people who are living under the favor of God through the grace of God. That's propitiation. And so what men like J.D. Greear, what men like James Merritt et al., I mean, it's a whole list I don't want to get into right now, but what they are doing is they're undermining the very principle of gospel faithfulness so that they can be more appealing to the culture around them. I always joke to you, and I tell you, I miss the days when being seeker sensitive was all about lights and smoke machines. And that our greatest arguments were over the type of music that could be played to being seeker sensitive. But what's happened now is even men who would have rejected the church growth movement that was so seeker sensitive, they're focused now on being seeker sensitive at a level that is bringing false doctrine into the church.
Yep. So what you see in a lot of that is leaders are honestly callous to what's actually happening in their people's lives. So we're going to talk about that as we flesh this out.
Let's talk about the fact that critical theory really does intend to tear down and destroy our society.
Yeah.
Critical theory can be understood. It can be seen as for what it is. It is an attempt. And when we talk about deconversion is rooted in this concept of deconstruction. And it was Jacques Derrida's view of, do words have meaning?
Yeah.
And he sought to deconstruct meaning itself. And then understand that in deconstruction, there's no reconstruction. That's why people right now that are confusing deconstruction with reformation, they don't understand postmodernism. You have to understand that deconstruction never reconstructs. It is a continuous venture for deconstruction. Michel Foucault applied Derrida's views to authoritarianism. And that's why they have an ethic of anti-authoritarianism. And so it really does seek to destroy the society around us. But it's not just critical race theory. Critical race theory applies the tenets of critical theory to race issues. And let's only deal with it in America. Let's not deal with it in an academic sense. Let's deal with it in the application sense. But critical queer theory is just as dangerous, but it's different in the sense that it focuses on the oppressed sexualities where intersectionality is concerned. And that's what we recently saw where Disney is concerned. Talk to us about that for a minute.
Yeah. I mean, what you're seeing at Disney right now with all these videos in the news of basically Disney being taken over by a hostile group of activists that's seeking to inject LGBT content in every aspect of their content and they state this with the intention of turning kids trans or homosexual. And I'm going to say it that way because that's what's happening. That's unpopular to say now,
well, and,
but that is exactly what's happening.
You've been faulted more than I have for using the term groomer. And a groomer is someone that is a sexual deviant, a sexual predator that finds a minor and grooms them for basically sexually assaulting them, taking sexual advantage of them. Yeah. And so these people are groomers. They're seeking to groom children through media in order to turn them into trans and homosexual children.
And we've all seen the statistics now, I hope, but we're going to keep saying this because some people haven't. The latest statistics are the latest generation, over 40% identify as some kind of in the LGBTQ plus
which
spectrum.
Shows that it's not genetic, by the way.
It's not genetic. That was actually where I was going. That shows that it is not, we know now full and well people were not born that way, but they are groomed into that way. And so that's what Disney has said is their goal. But what we need to understand is that is just a subset of critical theory. That is a subset of the goal of all critical theory, which is to tear down and destroy society so that it can build it back up in the image of what it wants.
Jeffrey Johnson has a great book on social justice, and he points out the roots in Marxism of all of these things. And Marxist tenets were taken to this school in Germany, the Frankfurt School, where critical theory was really formed. And a lot of people don't understand the most dangerous aspect of critical theory, and it's true in critical race theory because the Black Lives Matter movement said we want to destroy the nuclear family.
Yep.
And it's absolutely, this is where critical race theory, critical queer theory, even though their tenets are different, this is where they're coming together. They have a huge goal of destroying the nuclear family. They view Christian, heterosexual, monogamous marriage that seeks to have a two-parent household to raise their children in good education. That is a system and structure that critical theory is a heat-seeking missile seeking to destroy. And so when you see someone talking about any form of critical theory trying to say that, well, it's just trying to bring justice to marginalized people. No, it's not. The gospel does that. What this does, it seeks to unseat Christianity and every aspect of it. But understand, if you want to be faithful to your wife, they want you to get divorced. If you want to be a good father, they want you to leave your kids. They want to destroy your family. They want to. And this is why parental rights in education is so vital, because they want teachers who will seek to train your children to be social justice revolutionaries, they want them to have more influence legally in your child's life than a mother and a father have in that same child's life. That is demonic. These groomers are from the pits of hell.
Yeah. What everyone needs to understand is the tenets of critical theory is just seeped into what now is just broadly understood as wokeism. Like that, the term wokeism, I would say, was helpful because a lot of times you'll get these criticisms of, oh, that critical theory, critical race theory, critical queer theory, these are very technical academic terms, which is true. But we can walk and chew gum at the same time. There are technical academic terms that are also put into a populace, and then the populace doesn't even understand what they are actually perpetuating. So you end up, because these academic theories are all throughout the education system, all throughout the teacher training, all throughout the corporate training. And so down the line, pretty quickly, and this is where we are now, you end up with a whole bunch of academics, administrators, teachers, people in corporate offices all across the country who are subscribing to and implementing tenets of critical theory and not realizing what they're doing. But we can identify all those very broadly as wokeness.
Oh, yeah.
It is just wokeness, and critical theory is behind it, and it intends to ultimately destroy the family. And by doing so, it intends to destroy the very fabric of society so that it can build its Marxist utopia.
Yeah.
That's what it's doing.
Your children are going to be taught by educators, because what the Frankfurt School did really well is Saul Alinsky taught people to infiltrate college education, and they took over schools of education throughout colleges all throughout our country, and they trained educators to be ground zero for social justice movements in America. And you need to understand that many teachers in school, go to Libs of TikTok on Twitter just for 5 minutes and you'll see this all over the place. They've been trained not to use curriculum to subvert your children, but to sneak questions into quizzes, to talk to your children about social justice, to display flags. This is all a movement in order to teach your children outside of curriculum and influence them not to chase after education and academic disciplines, but rather to be little revolutionaries. So yes, you need to understand critical theory is not a boogeyman.
Right.
Critical theory is real, and they're trying to get your children to believe that you are an oppressive individual simply because you believe in biblical tenets of marriage and family. It's at that level in our culture now. Yeah. And any pastor or evangelical leader that cannot see this is a fool.
Yeah.
And unqualified for their position, quite frankly.
That's where we're at right now. And understand the tenets of Marxism have always sought to turn children against their families, because they've always understood the building block of society is the family. Where strong families are, totalitarian governments cannot take over. And so you saw this in the Soviet Union. They turned the kids against the parents. You saw it very violently in China during the Cultural Revolution.
And you and I have actually had conversations in country with the children of those people, and those children had no concept of family. They didn't understand it, and they wore the scars.
Yeah, the tie between children and their parents have been completely separated, and successfully. And so there's many examples of this in totalitarian communist countries. What is happening now in our country and in the West in general is a different thing, because it's happening what Rod Dreher calls soft totalitarianism. It's happening through corporations and through education and through media. And so right now, because they could not get the government, they're getting it through non-governmental means. But in a lot of ways, it's even more insidious. They're seeking to separate and remove family structures.
And so be careful, if your middle schooler begins to view you as a bigot, then you need to understand that someone in their school is influencing them where critical theory is concerned. And it's not at all inaccurate to call a person promoting any level of wokeness a groomer. It doesn't just have to start with queer agenda. It doesn't even have to just start with a trans agenda. Any form of wokeness is an attempt to groom your children towards absolute wickedness. And it is a good thing that we are mad at Disney.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. So don't listen to anybody. Yesterday, Southern Baptist pastor Jimmy Scroggins, I like to call them by name, but Jimmy Scroggins went on making fun of people for being angry at what Disney is doing.
Yeah.
And he wasn't wrong at one level.
Right.
Because at one level, he points out all organizations and companies in our country are wicked to a degree. But even if you don't think, and this is a fine thing, if whether you want to boycott them, I understand what you're doing there, or if you don't want to boycott them, I fully understand what you're doing there. But you can't deny the upfront wickedness. And at this point in culture, Disney is the ultimate example, because I'm not seeing any videos from McDonald's boardrooms talking specifically about grooming children. But we have the evidence from Disney that they are doing that. But we should be just as mad as we are at Disney at the sweet mom of two kids, second grade Chesterfield County school teacher who puts up a rainbow flag on her door and tells kids if they are trans, she's a safe person for them.
Yeah.
It's easier to boycott Disney World than it is to confront something that's going on in the local county. And that is going on in the local county right now.
Yeah. I mean, that's really what I want people to understand. Yes, we need to be very upset with Disney. Yes, we need to be very upset with all of woke corporations, but realize, and I know that this example is going to hit with people who are listening to this. You should be just as mad at your office manager who kind of mindlessly institutes a new diversity, equity, and inclusion program that is teaching critical theory and Marxist values embedded in it. They are just as much, and unfortunately, a groomer. Now, they might not be with kids, and that kind of takes it to another level, and we understand that, and we need to fight appropriately. But they are desensitizing people all across corporate America to critical theory, and so we got to be just as frustrated with them.
Yeah, and it's also a point where you need to educate yourself. You need to. That's why these podcasts are vital.
I do want to say I have grace for people who did not know that because DEI is all throughout corporate America. I get it. It just sounded nice. Diversity, equity, inclusion. Who could be against that? Yeah. Well, critical theorists are insidious in that way. They intentionally use words that sound nice and then put all this awful critical theory into it. So I'm not condemning you if maybe even you have participated in that in the past, but wise up.
Wolves don't infiltrate leadership teams by baring their teeth. They infiltrate leadership teams by putting on the cloak of a shepherd, the fur, I forget what you call it in this moment, the wool of a sheep, rather. Yeah. They do that, and they sneak in under the kindest of terms. Yeah. You want to talk about civility? There's no one more civil than a false teacher. Yes. There's no one with more dignity than a false teacher. There's no one presenting more faux fruits of the Spirit than a false teacher. And then when they get on the inside, that's where they begin to bare their teeth. And for a lot of people, that's what's going on right now, is this equity, this inclusiveness. It sounds so good, but now we're beginning to see, man, these are wolves in disguise.
But I want to say this. I think it's important. As mad as you are as Disney, you should be just as vocal about pastors who over the last 2 years went and mindlessly supported BLM protests, who went and turned their profile pictures black on social media. Like, they were letting in and supporting critical theory, which ultimately leads to critical queer theory, which ultimately leads to kids being groomed. Yep. Like, there's a direct line there, and their ignorance is not going to be an excuse.
Soft-handed pastors, and that's probably more offensive than you think it is, but soft-handed pastors who have complained about my tone for 2 years are directly responsible for allowing this madness to take place. Denominational leaders, at minimum, are guilty of grave malpractice in so many of these issues. And our point is that all of this danger is real. Yep. The threat is real. And so leaders who write articles like CRT isn't going to hurt you, those leaders are not vanilla. They are dangerous leaders. Jake Medor wants to have influence, and he's wielding it in a dangerous way to please the friends that he wants to have in ivory towers in the academy. What they don't see, or what they refuse to see, is all of the ways that critical theory is deceiving people with lies.
Yeah, I think I'll continue to say that the verse for all this, and the prophets actually say this quote several times. The one I like is Jeremiah 8:11. They have healed the wounds of my people lightly, saying peace, peace, where there is no peace. I want that idea from the Old Testament prophets just to be ingrained in our people's mind, because it's happening everywhere. People saying there's no threat. Don't worry about it. Don't be on guard. Don't fight a culture war. And we have to be on guard, because these people literally want your kids to go to hell.
Yeah. And what's funny is Jake Meter talks about how, do you remember in the early 2000s when people said the emergent church who tried to apply postmodernism at the church level? Remember when we said they were a threat and then, we didn't hear anything about them? What Jake Meter is too glib to understand about the reality is they didn't go anywhere. They're the very people influencing critical theory in the life of the church. They're the very people doing that. Those threats did not end.
No.
Those threats grew up and they became Marxist, bent on bringing deconversion into the lives of our children. They're the ones seeking to build a deconstructionist mindset where faith in Jesus Christ is concerned. And they continuously note that the goal here is to create fear. Yes, but a fear based in reality. People like Jake Metter, and I always go back to the deconstructionist because that's what she is, Karen Swallow Pryor. They are not afraid for their livelihood. Because these people are insulated by the very evangelicalism that they incessantly attack. But the people working in secular environments, the people that we have personal relationships with, they know what's actually happening out there in the culture. So Jake Metter isn't even qualified to talk about these issues.
We end up talking a lot about kids and the grooming happening in schools, and that is really important because Scripture is even clear. There's another level when it comes to kids, another level of concern and protection that we need to have. However, we also talk to all kinds of adults in corporate America. And so I do think we want to say we're trying to protect you pastorally too. There is insidious things happening in corporate America. Wokeness in critical theory is coming in through HR departments and coming in through equity programs. And we see pastorally a real threat. It's already happening. We hear the stories, but increasingly over time of people being desensitized to really, honestly, just to be frank, allowing a lot of sin into their life. Through what corporate America is pressuring them to do. And pastorally, we need to say something because it is putting people's faith in danger. You can only compromise so much before it really does have an effect on your soul. And I do kind of see a future in America where the church almost has to be underground, where you have to, I don't fault, let's give this example, a Chinese Christian who has to be kind of quiet about their faith and go along with the party lines or something like that in communist China because they got to feed their family. We're headed there here. We're not there yet. But
we don't want that to happen.
And we don't want that to happen. And the point is, we need to put up some resistance.
I think some of the people I know want it to happen.
I'm worried about that.
I don't want it to happen.
So it is not something that you need to have no concern about if your corporate employer is asking you to lie and put pronouns in your bio. Like, that's just an example, but I can see, and I already know actually this is happening, that people think, well, what's the big deal? I'm not actually saying the wrong pronoun. No. I'm saying the right pronoun. I'm putting he, him in my bio. But what you're doing is you're bending the knee to Caesar. Like, what you're doing is you are, by doing that action, saying, I'm saying something I know that is ridiculous and silly. I know that there are two genders, that God created a good creation design, but I'm putting this in my bio to get along, to go along. And my pastoral concern is enough things like that over time eventually begins to wear on your soul and causes you to compromise.
Yeah, you're giving a pinch to Caesar. Here's the key. You cannot ever give to Caesar something that doesn't belong to him.
Yeah.
Jesus' point in saying, give the money to Caesar because his face is on it, he was actually speaking of the image of God in man. And he was saying God's image is in the life of man. Yeah. You cannot give your body. You cannot give who you are. You cannot give your pronouns to Caesar, no matter what form of authority he is in your life, whether it's the CEO of a company, whether it's the President of the United States. Caesar doesn't own your body. God does. And the key is if we're going to flourish in a negative world, we're going to need pastors who are realists rather than pietists. Many Christian leaders right now are embracing a hyper-pietism as a way of dealing with the world, and they answer every difficulty with over-spiritualized statements. Well, brother, but they'll look to us and say, brother pastor, well, brother, just pray about it. Well, just love other people.
Yeah.
Just do this, just do that. And it's always some over-spiritualized reality that isn't dealing with what's actually going on in the world. And this is a effort to be gnostically disconnected from the world and treat the physical as if it doesn't matter. Well, it does.
Yeah.
It really does.
Yeah. People want to act like there is this virtue in kind of being above it all and being disconnected from the harms of the world. Like, who cares if persecution comes? What really matters is your relationship with Christ, brother.
Yeah.
And it is so unhelpful because we are called to live in the real world.
It's unhelpful and it's unhealthy.
Yeah.
That is not, because what they want to do is they'll mask that under this facade of they're more spiritually mature than you are because you're concerned, you have too many concerns in the physical world.
Yeah.
That's not mature. That's false doctrine because it treats the physical as though God doesn't care about it. And that's an ancient heresy as long as the Church of Jesus Christ. Yeah. And so we have to understand the physical world does matter to God. We do have to care about the cultural rot that's going on around us. We have to care about these things.
Absolutely. And so another tactic that you'll see then is them calling everything an idol. Everything that one might care about is an idol. Do you care about what the school systems are teaching? Well, you've made that an idol. Yeah. Do you care about the nuclear, like we talk about nuclear family all the time? We're accused of making the family an idol. Yeah. That's ridiculous.
Oh, it's completely ridiculous, and it's so foolish. And I've dealt with this one for a long time. People will say doctrine has become an idol to you, and that is such an over spiritualized load, man. It is so foolish, and it is a lie. Do not believe it. Yes, things can be turned into idols, but caring about something that God has shown us, explicitly in Scripture that He cares about, that's not idolatry. That's faithfulness.
The thing that I have seen sneak in a few times, this is on the horizon, I have seen people calling creation design an idol. Your concerns with manhood and womanhood is an idol.
Well, Christianity Today, they recently posted an article saying that if we want to reach the next generation, we have to embrace evolution. I
saw that too.
And deny creationism and stop trying to put forward creationism. And it's just like there is no, and this is where caring what the world thinks can turn you actually into someone who is idolatrous. Because when you bend the knee to Baal, that's literal idolatry. When you start telling people they have to deny biblical truths, that's when you've become idolatrous. Denying biblical truths does not further the cause of evangelism, even an inch. Creationism is biblical. Never bend the knee on creationism.
Yep. So in all this, we, as you said at the beginning, we cannot cover every facet of this. We've done 3 episodes and there's more we could say. But this kind of wrap-up episode is really us to say, this stuff matters. It's not a boogeyman. It is a threat, and you will be made to care. And what I mean by you will be made to care is if this is not already impacting you and your family, and for many of our listeners it is, but it's coming. You cannot avoid this stuff. Critical theory has taken over corporations, education, and entertainment. So it is already there. Your probably eyes just aren't opened if you haven't already noticed. But this stuff is a threat that you have to be honest and serious about.
Yeah, let's close this and just kind of defining. Let's be as brief as we can. What do we mean by culture war?
Yeah. I think that is really important. And we simply mean this, understanding that the left, the progressive, and that is who we're talking about in this context, the progressive left, critical theorists, whether they understand that that's what they're implementing or not, are rising and dominating in our culture and are actively seeking to destroy faith. Okay, when you have a culture that is actively seeking to destroy another culture, what do you call that?
Yeah.
It's a war.
Yeah. And I've seen a couple of different, evangelical leaders, theologians, try to give all sorts of names to this, using every word they can but war. But we're in a culture war.
Yeah. And so there's always been individuals in society. And that's why the positive, neutral, negative world framework is so helpful. There have always been individuals in society that have sought to destroy the Christian faith. There have even been individual organizations in society that have sought to do this. Like, this is nothing new. We're not saying that is. But what is new and what we have to understand has changed in our society rapidly is all of the overwhelming governments and organizations of society, from education, government, corporatism, entertainment. They are all now unified and sure in their intent to destroy the Christian faith. And that is not us being alarmist. Yeah. That is from their own mouths and materials.
This is new ground.
It is new ground.
This is the first time. There has never been a post-Christian culture in the West where all of the ideologies in power have sought to destroy the Christian faith.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what they're doing. And to say anything short of that they have a goal of destroying the Christian faith is dishonest.
Yeah.
It's glib. You don't know what time it is. This is a new situation, and we need to understand it as a war in order to gauge people in resisting it.
Right.
The real war is in the resistance against the false ideologies.
I have no doubt about a couple things. One, the church wins because Jesus wins, and the church goes where Jesus goes. So this is not a concern about that. You start talking about this, and people instantly, and this is, again, the pietists speaking up, saying, brother, you need to have faith. You need to trust God. Believe me, I'm well aware that God is in control. I just want to be working with him as much as I can. So also we would say this is a particular Western issue. The East had its own issues we've already discussed that often came through totalitarian governments. But the whole world is not in the same circumstances. Actually, there are places in Africa that are not facing either issues. They just have their own economic issues. But we live in the West, and so we're called to minister and pastor to the West.
Yeah, and I hate it when people talk about, well, the West isn't everything, but just happens to be where I live.
It has to be everything to my immediate surroundings.
Yeah, so it pretty much is everything to us.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, and this is where the Gospel Coalition has gone to where they don't understand how philosophy works, is they act like that critical theory is completely divorced from secular humanism, that somehow secular humanism has ceased to be a threat, and we're just identifying a new threat because secular humanism died. No, this is secular humanism. This is a new tool from secular humanism, which is seeking to use every tool at its disposal. Sexual revolution, they're seeking to use scientism, they're seeking to use critical theory, and they all partner together now. This is what postmodernism has done. It brings all of them together, and this is how you know it's demonic, because who's the one enemy of all those things that they have picked? The Christian faith.
Yeah.
It's all against the Christian faith, and you have to wake up to that reality.
Yeah. Culture war is about defending the goodness, the rightness, the righteousness of the Christian faith and Christian morality. And so that is a good thing. We ought not to be ashamed of that. Yeah. We actually believe that Christianity is better for everyone.
We have a better culture, we have an enduring culture, we have an eternal culture.
Yeah, there's a huge lie, and this just comes from critical theory, that all cultures are the same, that you can't criticize a culture, and that history proves that to be absurd. But as Christians, we must believe that Christian culture is what God intends and designs for his creation. And so we want to promote that as good and right and beautiful.
Yep.
And it's our job to do that. And so that is culture warring. And it is silly to pretend that that's not culture warring. Yep. It is our culture warred against another.
You fight the culture, evangelize the faith, disciple your family, defend doctrine, steep yourself in orthodox Christian theology and doctrine, hold the line. Do not buy the lie. That is where mission and doctrine intersect. That is why we call this podcast Converge.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We will, of course, be back in 2 weeks with another new podcast. If you'll do us a favor, if you find this helpful, if you find the content edifying and exhorting, go ahead and give us a 5-star review. Write a paragraph or two about how great me and Nate are. We would be abundantly thankful. That would help us in our reach. But once again, thanks for joining us for the Converge podcast.